Good afternoon and welcome, distinguished guests, excellencies, ambassadors, the Soufan Group. It's wonderful to be here again at the Global Security Forum. As noted, I'm Jennifer Vaughan, the spokesperson for the UN Special Envoy for Syria, today here in my personal capacity. As we've been hearing this morning, the global landscape is marked by intense and overlapping crises, from the devastating war in Gaza, the ongoing fighting in Ukraine, the conflict in Sudan, persistent violence in Haiti, to the humanitarian and political crisis in Myanmar. These are not isolated emergencies. They reflect broader shifts in the nature of conflict, increasingly complex, politically charged, and enduring, with devastating consequences for civilians and growing challenges for those seeking to respond. Mohammed, as noted, you're the Assistant Secretary General for Communication Resource Development at Qatar Red Crescent Society. And I'd like to start by first noting our condolences to the many losses that the Red Crescent Society has suffered in Gaza and elsewhere. It's been a devastating year for humanitarians. Contemporary conflict zones are often defined by intricate political dynamics and severe humanitarian crisis, and the involvement of both state and non-state armed groups. Can you talk about how Qatar Red Crescent Society has developed since it founded in 1978, adapting to these changes?
أولاً أصحاب السعادة الزملاء الكرام، يشرفني أن أشارككم اليوم في هذه الجلسة الهامة لمناقشة دور المنظمات الإنسانية في مناطق النزاع المختلفة حول العالم. طبعا نحن في الهلال الأحمر القطري تعلمنا من خبرة العمل في أكثر من 60 دولة حول العالم، من بينها البيئات الأكثر تعقيداً وأحياناً الأكثر خطراً على مستوى العالم. الشراكة الفاعلة مع الجمعيات المحلية الوطنية سواء كانت هلال أحمر أو صليب أحمر هي وأيضاً سرعة الاستجابة هي يعني من أسس الشراكة الفاعلة، وهو أمر جوهري. مثلاً في اليمن، في سوريا، في الصومال وغيرها، كان نجاحنا مرتبط بتعزيز الاستجابة المجتمعية، دعم الأنظمة الصحية المحلية وتفعيل الدبلوماسية الإنسانية لفتح مسارات الوصول عندما تغلق الأبواب الأخرى في وجه المنظمات الإنسانية. بالتأكيد أيضا سمعتنا وخبرتنا الكبيرة في المجال الطبي أهلنا لدخول العديد من مناطق النزاع حول العالم، وكانت مشاركة فاعلة وجيدة. أيضا دعينا نتكلم هنا أن الشبكة الإنسانية العالمية الكبيرة، كما تعلمين الهلال الأحمر القطري هو عضو من حركة دولية كبيرة للصليب الأحمر والهلال الأحمر. لدينا 191 شريك حول العالم، هذا أيضا مصدر قوة من مصادر قوة الهلال الأحمر القطري، بالإضافة طبعا إلى الاتحاد الدولي واللجنة الدولية. هذا كله يتيح لنا قدرة فريدة على الاستجابة الفورية. الاستجابة الفورية هي عنصر مهم، ربما يكون الأكثر أهمية، أنك تصل إلى الميدان أولاً وتمتلك الخبرة لتمد يد العون للمحتاج، للمتضرر، للاجئ مهما كان. طبعا هذه كلها أدوار محورية في شتى الكوارث وفي شتى الأزمات أينما وقعت حول العالم، بما يتماشى في النهاية مع المبادئ الإنسانية العالمية. هي مبدأنا الأول في التعامل عند دخول أي بلد، عند دخول أي منطقة، يعني نضع نصب أعيننا ونركز على مبادئ الإنسانية العالمية، لأنها هي يعني وسيلتنا للدخول في هذه المناطق وللعمل فيها.
Focusing on human values is a good point for Mariana to come in, the director for the Center for Humanitarian Leadership. You actually have decades of experience as a nurse practitioner and many years of experience designing, implementing, and overseeing humanitarian development plans. You've noted that you think that there's been a persistent failure of the former international-led system that we're seeing today to effectively reach these conflict-affected areas, and to the growing importance of the local and hyper-local leadership in order to reach these affected populations. We heard from Mr. Riyad Saleh on Syria this morning. Can you speak to your experience working in some of these conflict situations and reaching communities these ways?
Thank you, everyone, for your time and also for your comments. As she mentioned, I am a nurse practitioner by training. I spent most of the last 15 years or so working in and around the Syria response, like you, working closely with local communities, doctors, nurses, other ancillary health staff. I was sitting safely behind my laptop in Turkey. I was helping to coordinate funding and medical supplies and advocacy campaigns. But the real leadership was not happening from Turkey in this case. It was the doctors and nurses who were holding their communities together despite the bombing, despite the lack of international response, despite the complete lack of the Security Council to enforce any semblance of a rules-based order for Syrians. We see the same thing happening in places like Sudan, Congo, Myanmar. So my view for the last 5 years, all of my work has been really inspired by local leaders and local leadership. Looking at places like Syria, I think Raid and the White Helmets are a really great example. They got on with the work despite the fact that the bombs were still falling. When COVID happened in northwest Syria, you had millions of people trapped in that whole geographic area, and it was the White Helmets and the local medical groups who responded to that pandemic. The earthquake is another example from 2 years ago. Local leaders will always find a way. They're there before the international actors and long after we leave, and we sort of close up shop, whether it's because of funding or political crisis. So my view is the humanitarian system is undergoing another reform due to urgent funding crisis. Let that system reform do its thing. Where I want to spend my energy is where and how we can support local leaders. Because I see a lot of energy being wasted in a humanitarian sector reform, and that's to the neglect of the people who are actually managing those conflicts and crises around the world.
Joëlle, you also have significant field experience. Currently, you're the director for the Center of Competence of Humanitarian Negotiation, a joint initiative of 5 leading humanitarian organizations, but you also worked for several years with ICRC in the field, including Colombia, South Sudan, and the Ivory Coast. You've spoken to the impact of what happens when conflicts become more fragmented. We've talked a bit about Gaza, Syria, Yemen, Sudan, elsewhere, and how you've seen the negotiation dynamic shift when actors are non-state, decentralized. Can you share some of your experiences and insights?
Sure, thank you. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be here. And indeed, let me start a bit by also acknowledging, I think, the hard work of all our colleagues, humanitarian colleagues in the field in some of the hardest crises we see today. We talked, of course, we're thinking about Gaza, about Ukraine, about Sudan, Haiti is another place where we just see the increased complexity of the crisis we're facing and the difficulties our colleagues have to actually try to respond in the best way they can. And this is where I think negotiation comes in. And I think we've seen a bit when we think about the complexity of the crisis today, looking at the negotiation landscape from a humanitarian point of view, one key challenge is, of course, the fragmentation, the multiplication of actors on the ground, and especially I think this conference is also about non-state actors, and from a humanitarian point of view there is of course many armed actors that are of humanitarian concerns that we need to engage with as humanitarian organizations, and what we mean by that, it's really how are we able to engage, to negotiate with this multiplicity and diversity of actors that will allow us to then respond to the crisis in the best way we can. And this, of course, we'll come back to it, but it has profound dilemmas. We also discussed, I think, another challenge that of course, comes out today is very much the security of and the safety of humanitarian staff. I think looking at the landscape, we also have to be very much, I think, and here we need the support of states, like the state of Qatar also, that reminded us this morning, His Excellency, the Prime Minister, of the importance of dialogue, very much key. And here, in order to maintain a humanitarian space, we also very much have to collaborate with states who are showing this leadership and support in maintaining those humanitarian values. Because one trend we also see in this complexity is very much what one could call the securitization of the humanitarian sector. So it starts with killing and targeting of humanitarian staff. We all know those last few years especially have been extremely difficult for civilians, but it's also 2024 was the deadliest year for humanitarian workers, so we've lost the highest number of colleagues in the field that were targeted, that were killed. So that is one way we really need to have the support of all the different actors that work in crisis to not let that be a precedent and not be normalized. I think beside the targeting, we very much see also the challenge of perception, misperception of what humanitarians do, why they're here, what are they engaging with this diversity of actors, with staff being detained, as we know, for example, in Yemen and other places. And I think the last extreme we also saw where we very much need the support of the international community as a humanitarian industry is when some organizations are started to be prohibited to operate, like we see with UNRWA. And so those are, I think, some of the challenges we face. Of course, there is also very much the dynamic, volatile nature of all the actors we talk to. I think Afghanistan, Syria are the perfect examples where they shift roles very, very quickly. And as humanitarians, the way we've been engaging, the relationship we were able to build or not will be very, very important in order to be able to maintain a meaningful and impactful humanitarian response. So I think that to all of that to say with this increased complexity, of course, negotiation is not just a choice for humanitarian, but it becomes very much a humanitarian imperative. And so at the center of competence on humanitarian negotiation, in just 6 years, we have 8,300, humanitarians who joined a community of practice, which is basically a network of humanitarian professionals who have a common purpose and want to improve their negotiation skills. And to maintain such a space that is basically about collaboration, that is about togetherness, that is about, critically thinking and reviewing the way we negotiate, we need also, again, the support of the multiple actors we have in crisis environment, and hence I want also to thank the Sufan Center and the State of Qatar for convening such a conference that brings together security actors, humanitarian actors, diplomats, private company. We need much more of that.
We do indeed. Shelly, your work at the RAND Corporation has focused on disaster and post-conflict recovery, immigration, mass migration policy, refugees, global education. The list goes on and on. We've been talking briefly about addressing the needs of those who need it in addition to the policy. In Gaza, 51,000 people have been killed, among them 15,000 children, not to mention the thousands who are missing and the destruction of homes. I think the needs assessment that was conducted by the UN and the EU and the World Bank put the reconstruction money that would be needed upward of $53 billion. Your work now is focused at looking at the post-conflict and infrastructure in Gaza and the West Bank. Can you talk about the ways in which you need to serve the immediate needs of the Palestinians in Gaza and West Bank, also while looking to ensure that their long-term needs are accounted for?
Thank you very much. It's a great pleasure to be here, and thank you very much to Qatar for the opportunity. So during the war, we've been working on a set of 3 plans for the day after and longer than the day after in Gaza and the West Bank. The first has been a big picture foundational plan, what needs to happen with security, governance, economics, and reconstruction. The second plan has focused on infrastructure, looking at both the West Bank and Gaza. What are long-term infrastructure needs across 6 sectors, such as transportation, water, energy, etc. Came up with some 200 plans, projects, some of which can be done now, and some of which might require a political solution, but really looking at both the near term and the long term. And the third project, I think, fits more squarely in this humanitarian space, which is looking at the question of there's been so much destruction in Gaza. Where could Gazans possibly live without leaving Gaza while staying there? So what we tried to do was learn from lessons learned, history of the past. A typical response to mass destruction and displacement is putting people in camps. I think we've learned that camps are really miserable places, and that once a camp is set up, it lasts forever. So that if a camp's set up today, 20, 50, 70 years from now, people will still be living in it. And so we tried to tackle the question of how do you set up circumstances today that sets up Gaza for the long term for a quality and dignified reconstruction. I think a key concept that has gone through a lot of these projects, in particular in trying to take an evidence-based approach to humanitarian operations, is that the temporary becomes the permanent. If you set up camps today, people live in them 70 years from now. If refugees cross the border and flee, the vast majority of them never return home. And so thinking about setting up humanitarian structures today so that it's laying the groundwork for the future.
Just thinking the list of emergencies is just sad and growing. You know, all of us have spoken about Syria, where 14 million people were displaced both inside and outside the country. The hunger and the needs in Sudan, where 30 million people are in need. I mean, the list is just enormous, and the needs are enormous. Mohammed, I was wondering how you're working to try and develop what Mariana was addressing as well, how to develop local actors so that they have capacity to try and contribute to the greatest means possible to helping to solve some of these most pressing issues.
نعم بالتأكيد الهلال الأحمر القطري عندما يصل إلى أي مكان في يعني بعد انتهاء الحرب أو أي أزمة إنسانية دائما يكون في نصب أعيننا التركيز على الشريك المحلي. يجب أولا تزويده بكل ما يحتاجه، لأنه هو شريكنا في النهاية وهو من ينفذ على أرض الميدان. يعني هناك أمثلة كثيرة، آخرها مثلا التعاون بين الهلال الأحمر القطري والهلال الأحمر السوري. بالتأكيد هو الشريك، هو من ينفذ على أرض الميدان. ففي البداية بالتأكيد بصفتنا شركاء مع 100 وأكثر من 191 منظمة، نركز دائما على الشريك الذي يعمل في المجال الإنساني في أي بلد نذهب إليه، ومن ثم ننتقل إلى القطاعات الأخرى، سواء كانت القطاعات الطبية، القطاعات الصحية، التمكين الاقتصادي، والعديد من المشاريع التي بها استدامة. ربما أنا أختلف بالرأي مع الزميلة في شأن المخيمات. صحيح أن المخيمات أحيانا تبقى لسنوات طويلة، مثل ما تفضلت ربما ل60 أو 70 عام، ولكن نحن لا نستطيع. أنا بصفتي عامل في المجال الإنساني وشاهد على معاناة اللاجئين في عديد من مناطق النزاع حول العالم. يعني هناك مخيمات كانت عبارة عن خيام للاجئين لأكثر من 12 عاما، وفي مناطق هي شديدة البرودة، قاسية جدا، وشديدة الحرارة أيضا في الصيف، وهناك الكثير من الأوبئة والأمراض التي تعرض لها هؤلاء اللاجئين بسبب يعني الخوف من تغيير ديموغرافية البلد أو استدامة هذه المخيمات. أنا أعتقد أنه في البداية يجب أن تقف معاناة الإنسان في هذه البلد، سواء كان لاجئ، سواء كان نازح، سواء كان بعد كارثة طبيعية. المهم أن تتوقف المعاناة، وبعد ذلك نستطيع أن نفكر بطريقة استراتيجية طويلة الأمد ليرجع الحال على ما هو عليه. هذا في البداية. أيضا هناك نقطة يعني تطرقت لها في الحديث، أود أيضا أن أتكلم عنها. نحن عندما نصل إلى منطقة نزاع، إلى منطقة كانت تعاني من ويلات الحروب أو كوارث طبيعية. لا تكون الأرض معبدة بالنسبة لنا. الطريق حتى الوصول أحيانا يكون في مشقة، يكون في تعب. أحيانا الدول إذا لم تتوفر مطارات في نفس الدولة، أحيانا الدخول عبر الدول المحيطة يعني نعاني أشد المعاناة كعاملين في المجال الإنساني للوصول إلى المكان الذي نود العمل فيه. أيضا عندما نصل يعني دائما هناك توتر، الناس خارجون من يعني نحن تحت ضغط شديد في التعامل مع هؤلاء اللاجئين الذين يحتاجون إلى حكمة شديدة وصبر في التعامل معهم. أيضا يعني كل المنكوبين في كل العالم، أيضا يعني تحديدا في المناطق التي بها نزاعات حربية أو حروب، هناك أيضا يعني خطر يعني شخصي على العاملين. يعني أنا كنت قبل شهر تقريبا في أحد المدارس الابتدائية للأطفال، كنا نصور بها واكتشفنا لاحقا وأخرجنا من المكان أن المكان غير آمن وكان يحتوي على ألغام أرضية. يعني نحن نعاني من كثير من الصعوبات في العمل الإنساني، ولكن يعني كانت المفاجأة والطامة الكبرى هي باستهداف العاملين يعني كان يعني عندما كنا نذهب إلى مناطق النزاع حول العالم، كان وجود الشارة الدولية للصليب الأحمر والهلال الأحمر هو رسالة اطمئنان لنا بأننا غير مستهدفين. لا توجد أي جماعة مسلحة أو أي جيش أو أي شخص أو كيان في العالم يستطيع استهدافنا لأننا محميون دولياً. ولكن الشيء هذا بدأ اختراقه بشكل تدريجي وربما يكون ممنهج. يعني دائما هي البداية تكون بالمفاجأة، بعدها يتحول الموضوع تدريجيا إلى أن يكون طبيعي، وهذا الشيء الذي يجب أن يقف تماما، أن لا يكون استهدافنا. يعني احنا فقدنا، شكرا على تعزيك، احنا فقدنا 8 زملاء في غزة من الهلال الأحمر الفلسطيني. قبلها أيضا فقدنا زملاء لنا من الصليب الأحمر اللبناني، وقبلها أيضا في العديد من مناطق العالم. يعني العاملين في القطاع الإغاثي الإنساني، العاملين في القطاع الطبي، هؤلاء خط أحمر يجب عدم المساس بهم. نحن نخاطر بسلامتنا، بأرواحنا، بحياتنا عندما نذهب إلى مناطق النزاع هذه لنقدم خبرتنا في المجال الإنساني، في المجال الطبي. فيعني أقل ما نستطيع أن نحظى به هو الحماية.
I'm sure all the panelists agree with you and everyone in the audience. And I know, Mariana, you have very strong opinions of this as well, that we're starting to sadly see the normalization of war crimes, not on a daily basis where something happens on Monday and then already by Tuesday we've moved on to something else. But in your experience, you've noted again how local communities are fighting back, right? We've seen resistance and networks in Sudan. And we've seen that in Myanmar as well with the civil disobedience movement. So can you talk about, how we should, first of all, not be seeing this normalization of these atrocities at an international level, but how communities are voicing that very loudly, those that are most affected by these egregious crimes?
For the last 70 or 80 years, we've structured the world around the idea of a rules-based order. Exactly what our colleagues spoke about, that certain symbols, certain types of work are protected in the name of humanity. And we've been seeing an erosion of this, I would argue, for the last 15 to 20 years. I think we witnessed it in Syria. It didn't matter how loud we shouted or how many dossiers we compiled to talk about the targeting of hospitals and health facilities. There was little or no accountability for that. And we're seeing additional repercussions of the erosion of that norm. Just a week and a half ago, in Al-Beshri camp in Darfur, the RSF rolled in and massacred hospital workers working there, who've been working there throughout many different kinds of contexts for decades to help their community. While we in the international space can shout about this, we can keep going back, we can keep having UN resolutions, The real resistance is still happening at the community level. They will continue keeping their hospitals open. They will continue running their schools because their children need an education. And what you're seeing, again, in a context where the international rules-based order is failing communities in many difficult places, you are seeing networks of, I would say, lowercase humanitarian. These aren't people who you say, what do you do for work? They don't say, I'm a humanitarian aid worker. They say, I'm a doctor, I'm a teacher, I'm a nurse, I'm an engineer, I get water to my community. So these are leaders working in crisis. They are creating networks of leadership and networks among them to continue getting aid to communities when the international system is frankly failing. But I think our other colleagues, and I would agree with this as well, we don't give up on that rules-based order. We have to make sure that we continue shouting loudly. Many of you in this room are working in academia, you're working in the security sector per se, you're working in counterterrorism. All of these things are very strongly linked, and at the very basic building block of humanity and humanitarian need are communities at the front line who may also be in the negotiating room, who may also be at the political table. Again, I think Raed al-Salah was a great example. A normal guy from Jishishagur who, when the bombs began falling in his community, he rallied others in the community to learn how to dig people out from under the rubble. And he's now the minister in the new government. That's a really incredible story of how did the Syrian civil society survive for the last 10 to 15 years, and what does that mean for Syria going forward? So, but that doesn't mean we stop shouting. We can't have our colleagues in the Red Crescent being afraid to open a hospital. We can't have our colleagues in Sudan being afraid to run a hospital in Darfur. We have to have some boundaries.
Joëlle, I want you to pick up on 2 points that Mohammed raised. One was about acceptance in the communities that you're serving and the strategic advantages that you find of diverse negotiating team, that's including women, minorities, and others. And then the second point that Mohammed brought up was ethical decisions that you often encounter in humanitarian conflict situations, that often there is no good choice, there's just the less bad choice, and how you go about making those decisions.
I mean, I think we heard it from everyone, right? How much the operating in those humanitarian crises has become dangerous. And I think in the end, how do humanitarians protect themselves? Of course, it's very much with the dialogue we have with states, but as I mentioned, it's also very much how we engage with all the actors on the ground. And that's where really negotiation, I think, have been underestimated for a very, very long time. And just to give you, a couple of examples, and I will come to the importance of the diversity, because of course, for the response to be accepted, and what we mean by accepted is actually we can get in, we are not being targeted, we are being understood why we're here and what we are doing. And I think there is still a lot of misunderstanding about what humanitarians do or don't do, what is the limits of our work, what are the parameters. And for example, the ICRC every year, they conduct a study to say, trying to map out how many actors, non-state actors out there and of humanitarian concerns. What does it mean? That means basically how many armed actors have exert control of a territory, meaning control of a population, and so they become a humanitarian concerns from a humanitarian point of view because they can exert violence. So just to give you an idea, in 2024, we counted for over 120 conflicts, that recognized conflict, and over 450 armed actors. And this has been an increasing trend for the last 6 years. So this, of course, includes gangs. Haiti is also another example where a lot of humanitarians are trying to create a certain level of dialogue with all those gang leaders in Port-au-Prince just to be able to access population in need. So I think one is really to acknowledge that, that engagement, that dialogue, that negotiation with those different armed groups has, of course, nothing to do with legitimation, but is our only tool to be able to access the people in need, and is our only tool to also be understood, be recognized, and hopefully reduce also the risk for our own staff. And here comes the importance of, we heard it from everyone here, I think, diversity, inclusion. A lot of studies have also shown, because of the complexity of the humanitarian crisis, you need to have a very diverse humanitarian team to be able to lead the negotiation. And here we've seen also in so many places, we know that the first one to respond when the crisis or disaster happen, the last one that will stay are always communities. And we've also, as a Center of Competence on Humanitarian Negotiation, increased our effort, not just to reach local humanitarian actors, but very much communities themselves. We see it in Gaza, we see it in Ukraine, as you say. They are there trying to support their communities, their families in providing a humanitarian response. And I think it's only more our responsibility now to really go a step further with the, I think, the funding crisis the humanitarian sector is going through. Some are saying it's also a crisis of purpose and meaning, but we know that in many places, the big international humanitarian system will be scaling down, which means it will be communities themselves that will be left trying to respond to growing needs, and that will be under increased pressure and risk while they're trying to negotiate their way through that. So I think here really the importance of diversity, and I want to also, on a very positive note, also to say, as we were saying, a lot of movements are there. We had the privilege to be in Afghanistan recently, and we ran workshop only for female frontline negotiators. So it was Afghan women who are leading civil society organizations. Some of them, they traveled 3 days throughout the country to come and sit there despite all the obstacles on the road for their own safety, because they had such a willingness to advance, to be part of the change. So I think it's not just capacity building, but it's how are we giving them the space, how are we giving them the recognition, and how are we giving them the agency.
Speaking, Shelly, to well-intentioned humanitarians, but ensuring that those well-intentioned humanitarians have the best outcomes to their work. And a lot of your work is about evidence-based analysis and bridging the humanitarian response also with the policy formulation. And your work in Syria, and particularly in Mosul, and the lessons that you've learned in bridging those groups of communities, right? Ensuring that the best policy exists. What lessons did you take away from Mosul and elsewhere that you see applicable to today's conflict, where the needs are so great, the destruction is so massive, the war crimes committed are immense?
I think there are a lot of lessons learned from looking at recent global refugee crises. Building on the idea that the temporary becomes permanent, one key issue globally with refugee situations is that once people flee as refugees, our RAND studies have found that only about 30% return 10 years after a conflict ends. So what that means is that once people cross a border as a refugee, the vast majority will never return. And I think that has vast implications for how refugee situations are managed, because many of the refugee responses assume that a situation is temporary, and if people just wait it out, they'll be able to return home and resume their normal lives. But what you see instead is that once people have entered into this situation, it lasts a really long time. And so keeping people trapped in situations where they're in long-term camps, or many countries don't allow refugees to work out of concern for their labor markets. So keeping them in a permanent state of not having self-sufficiency, or keeping children separated into special refugee schools, all of that makes very little sense when you think that once people have left, this is really permanent. So I think many of our studies have found that what's really needed in refugee situations is a radical rethinking of the idea of the temporary to the permanent, and planning for the longer term. I think in the case of Gaza, or in the case of camps, as Mohammed mentioned as well, One key issue is that in many cases, with say such destruction as in Gaza, camps are going to be inevitable. There's no other solution given the scale of destruction. But can we take what we know about permanence and design them better? Can you set up camps or living circumstances or labor markets or schools today, knowing that these are going to last, put good structures and foundations in place rather than something that's viewed as temporary and lower quality so that it lasts better into the future. So really using some of the lessons learned about the long-term nature of these circumstances and building that into the immediate response and not just responses down the line.
Mohammed, that's a great place for you to pick up about once the immediate crisis subsides, what role does the Qatar Red Crescent Society play in the long-term recovery? Shelly was just noting, that the immediate becomes short-term, long-term, permanent, and we're seeing more protracted crises. So what resilience building and post-conflict community work does the Red Crescent Society do?
نعم، بعد في مرحلة التعافي أو في مرحلة تعافي المجتمعات بعد الأزمات، طبعا ذكرت سابقا هو دعم قدرات الشريك المحلي. بعدها دائما هذه المناطق يكون هناك نقص شديد وحاد في القطاع الطبي بها. فأول شيء نفكر فيه ونتجه إليه هو دعم القطاع أو المنظومة الصحية، لأنها تكون في حالة انهيار أو متوقفة بعد النزاعات وبعد الحروب أو بعد الكوارث الطبيعية. فالأولوية تكون للقطاعات الطبية. بعد ذلك طبعا كل مشاريع الإصحاح، السلات الغذائية، الأمن، نعمل على الأمن الغذائي، على توفر المياه الصالحة للشرب، على عودة التعليم مجددا في تلك المناطق، على التمكين الاقتصادي لبعض العوائل والأسر التي فقدت مصدر رزقها. في عديد من هذه الأماكن ليست المشكلة بأن تعطيه سلة غذائية وزجاجات لماء صالح للشرب، الأمر أبعد من ذلك. فنحن نعمل على التمكين الاقتصادي لبعض عديد الأسر الذي تأثر خلال هذه الأزمات. أيضا نقوم بتدريبهم بشكل جيد للحصول على فرص عمل مناسبة. هناك مثلا على سبيل المثال التعاون الذي بيننا وبين العديد من منظمات الهلال الأحمر والصليب الأحمر، بأن يكون هناك تبادل للخبرات في المجال الطبي. الكثير من القوافل الطبية عندما تذهب من قطر، من الهلال الأحمر القطري إلى هذه البلدان، إلى أماكن النزاعات في مختلف دول العالم، يكون هدفها الأول هو إجراء العمليات الدقيقة لعدم توفر الأجهزة هناك وعدم توفر الأطباء. وثانيا التدريب، لا نكتفي بهذا، أيضا نقوم بالتعاون معهم، ويأتي كادر طبي من هذه البلدان إلى قطر ليتعلم مثلا على آخر التكنولوجيا في المستخدمة في المجال الطبي. هناك العديد من أوجه المساعدة الذي ممكن أن نقدمها للمجتمعات التي هي في طريقها إلى التعافي، بداية من القطاع الطبي، من الإصحاح، من توفير السكن مثل ما تفضلت الزميلة، سواء كان عن طريق المخيمات أو كان عن طريق إقامة قرى سكنية متكاملة. لقد تمكنا من إنشاء قرى سكنية متكاملة تحتوي على جميع المرافق، منها مستوصفات للعلاج، منها مدارس، رياض أطفال، أيضا تحتوي على مشاريع منزلية صغيرة كدعم للأسر التي تعيش في هذه المجتمعات. هي منظومة كبيرة، نحاول أن نقدم لها الدعم بشتى السبل لكي تتعافى بعد الأزمة.
And then they can continue on with their work. Mariana, I know that you think that grassroots efforts also offer operational advantage? Deeper community acceptance, better access, is that what you've seen in the context that you've worked in as well?
Yeah, I think sometimes local leadership gets oversimplified, that we as the internationals come in to support a context and we're leaning on the local for the contextual knowledge or the language or the understanding, but it's so much more than that. There's this ongoing question at the international level about capacity building of local actors, and I use that in air quotes. It's a constant hamster wheel that we need to build the capacity of local communities and local leadership. I like to push back on that because these communities are accountable to themselves. The emergency response rooms in Sudan, I'm not worried if I send my own personal money to the emergency response rooms about corruption or fraud. I know that they're taking that money and they're buying rice and they're making food for their family because the accountability is intrinsic. So I'd like to turn the whole model a bit upside down. Local communities are the most invested in making sure they survive. And when we as outsiders come along in partnership, a lot of magical things can happen, and that gives me a lot of encouragement, despite the fact that I'm quite pessimistic about the new reordering of the world, the lack of a rules-based order. It's quite terrifying. I might can I come back to the the building of better refugee camps, and just see what you think about this as well. We've known for a long time that refugee camps tend to be permanent and that refugee status tends to be very long and very permanent. But when we start building those camps in real time, we face a lot of pushback from the host community government often, and that's for any country. I think, and I worry, that we are entering, or we have entered a new age where we are lacking the kind of global solidarity that means I must care for the refugee. The last 70 or 80 years was built on this idea that we must care for someone who is running from conflict. And I think something has broken in the way the world is seeing that. It's not that, and I'm trying to think of an example where I'm not going to throw a government under the bus, so I'll use an imaginary country. In the early days of the Syria refugee crisis, we were told we could not build a better refugee camp because they didn't want to give the appearance of permanence. That's not an accidental or lack of knowledge or awareness. That's a quite intentional undermining of the human rights of refugees. So I would want to know, maybe how do we talk about the real politicized issue of why refugee camps continue to be built the way that they're built, and what we do to raise global awareness and solidarity around the human rights of everyone affected by conflict. Sorry to ask a question.
Just in closing, I want to focus briefly, Joëlle, if you can just speak also to the mental health and resilience that frontline negotiators now need, arguably have always need, but given the issues that Mohammed and others have raised, that they themselves have become targets now around the world. Are there any tools that you prepare people in these frontline negotiations to have?
Sure, I think it's a very important point. We're trying. Let's say when we started to build this community of humanitarian professional negotiators, it was very focused, of course, on the skills of negotiation, on providing a space, as there is no perfect recipe, of course, more about how do we share the knowledge, the practice, but very quickly, what came out also, in order to be fit for purpose, in order to be able to negotiate, you need also to take care about the mental health of staff. So we have also created within that community a space to see how can we build our resilience and hopefully not end up in those situations of burnout that we know is an issue. But I think what I want to maybe, because I see we're running out of time, add to this is, as much as we need to build our own resilience, we need to build our skills as humanitarians, I think, again, humanitarian crisis is a shared space. And I think it's a really strong call here for more collaboration, for more spaces like we have today, where humanitarian can better understand the efforts of diplomats, the efforts of private sector, the efforts of security companies, because in the end of the day, I think the Sudan peace talk was a very good example where in the end, you know, a ceasefire was not possible. They ended up talking about, you know, a humanitarian opening border cross point from Chad to Sudan. And I mean, you know, at the end of the day, whatever deal is being made at the political level, the negotiation will happen on the ground. So if us as humanitarian, we are not then there fit for purpose and able to have all this level of negotiation, multi-layered from the communities as we discussed all the way up to authorities, if we're not able to have all of those conversations and we don't have the support of states and other actors operating in an environment that understand why we're having those conversations, it becomes very, very difficult for any of those agreements to be implemented.
I want to thank you all for raising the urgent and complex realities and for emphasizing, of course, that we must ensure that the humanitarian efforts are rooted in humanity and a deep, deep commitment to those people that we serve. And my thanks again to Qatar and to the Soufan Center for bringing us all together. Thank you.